prosperity, growth, it's good for our economies, and division of labor has been key for economic development over centuries. At the same time, I think we need to realize that too heavy dependence on some specific commodities can create vulnerabilities for our free and open societies. And therefore, it's not as if free trade always promotes freedom. Actually, sometimes we have to be careful. And one example is too heavy dependence on gas from Russia. That was not obvious for everyone before Ukraine, but now it's obvious for everyone that the high dependence by European allies on imports of gas from Russia has made them vulnerable in a way they should never have been in the situation we are now with the brutal invasion of Ukraine. Second, I also believe that, of course, we should trade with China. China is the biggest, soon the biggest economy in the world. Trade with China has been important for many of our companies for prosperity, albeit also in the future. But we have to be aware of the same risks of too heavy dependence, for instance, on some rare earth minerals, which are key for many different technologies, including green technologies. We have to be aware of the risk of China controlling critical infrastructure. Not so many years ago, 2-3 years ago, it was a big discussion whether we should be concerned about Chinese control of 5G networks. Now I think everyone realizes that that is something that matters for our security. So we should not, in a way, in the shadow of the idea of free trade, open up and make our infrastructure vulnerable to Chinese control when we, for instance, speak about 5G networks. And then lastly, we should also realize the danger of too much what I would call naive free trade, if that leads to that we are sharing key technologies we are developing with authoritarian powers. So I'm not against trading with authoritarian countries. That will be the case, has been and will be the case in the future. But we need to be aware of the risks, the vulnerabilities, and therefore the work we now do in NATO to improve resilience, to increase awareness of these issues, and then in dialogue with allies in different ways, also ensure that we continue to be in favor of free trade, but we also have to have some limits and some guidelines on how to not create new vulnerabilities, as we have seen, for instance, with too high dependence on imports of Russian gas.
Secretary General, when you think about this within the context of the current situation with regards to climate change and the energy transition, I just want to read you a couple of comments that we've heard in recent days, as quoted to CNBC. The CEO of Exxon discussing the current energy situation and saying that society is going to pay a very high price if governments and industries abandon fossil fuels too soon. The CEO of BP essentially saying that the world needs to back those who deliver the energy that the world needs today as well as tomorrow. When you think about that within the context of where we are now, there is deep concern that consumers across the West and elsewhere are going to basically face a cost of living crisis in the coming months as a direct result of the situation that we're seeing today in Ukraine. What is your message to the oil and gas community at this point? Are you willing, as NATO allies, to work with them through this transition? Should we be investing more money now, and not just renewables, but also fossil fuels today?
So first of all, many NATO allies are, of course, working very closely with the industry, also the energy industry, and also those parts of the energy industry that are investing in fossil fuels. And what we see is that many of these companies, they're actually now also key in the transition away from fossil fuels. So I think a lot of the technology, the capital, the competence these companies have will be key for the transition away from fossil fuel.
So demonizing them isn't the way forward?
No, that's never the answer. But because the issue is that the question is not whether we have to move away from fossil fuels. There's no way we can achieve the goals we have set to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, either by moving away from fossil fuels and or by developing technologies for carbon capture. And I think we have to do both. Then, of course, the high prices we see now, they are a big problem for ordinary households throughout the world. And again, poor people are more vulnerable than rich people because they are more able to pay for higher energy prices. Those who don't have so much, for them this is really, really a serious problem. I think the answer is to increase supply. And of course, what we have seen is that the high prices on oil and gas and also the cut in supply has to some extent led to that some countries are moving back to coal. That is bad for climate, but of course it reflects the desperate situation they are in. Hopefully, and I think that also will happen and is happening, and that is that increased prices on oil and gas will also then incentivize investments in also more energy efficient solutions, because you can reduce emissions just by finding more energy efficient solutions, even though you continue to use different types of fossil fuels, by investing in new types of energy, everything from biofuels to clean both energy and reduce emissions at the same time.
You mentioned the backlash there. It's something that the UN Secretary General has also talked about, the risk of backlash because of the higher living costs. Essentially, power prices could take 3 to 5 years to fall back to lower levels, according to the CEO of Germany's largest power producer. There's a lot of speculation at this point about at a time in the near future, potentially as we move into the winter months, that you're going to lose the support of the public. What is NATO's strategy to ensure that that doesn't happen?
To convey how important this fight is, and to convey how important it is that we support Ukraine. Of course, there is no way to deny that we pay a price, as I said. But you have to remember that by far the highest price is paid by the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian armed forces. They're actually fighting every day. We see casualties, we see attacks on cities, on civilian infrastructure, on hospitals, on schools. So of course, I recognize that also people in NATO allied countries and partners see the consequences of the war because of higher energy prices, and I share those concerns, and as political leaders throughout the alliance, they are addressing that in different ways. But that's a very different situation than the situation people experiences in Ukraine, where they actually are killed and where we see atrocities and where people are afraid of their lives. So we have to put things in perspective. Second, and this is about a kind of moral and political obligation to Ukraine. But second, it is in our interest to support Ukraine. We support Ukraine partly because they are a close partner. We have worked with them for many years. But also because it will be our world, the world of NATO allies, will be more insecure if Putin wins this war. So it's in our security interest to make sure that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent nation, and therefore we need to provide support as long as it takes, and the option has a much higher price than to pay price now to ensure that Ukraine prevails.
Secretary General, walk us through how this looks from a hardware perspective. Are we going to see electric F-35s? I mean, where are we today in those types of prototypes?
Also, I'm very careful predicting exactly what kind of electric vehicles or whatever. It may be not electric, it may be hydrogen, there may be fuel cells. There are different types of energy solutions. I will not be specific exactly on what will be the winning technology. What we see now, at least when it comes to vehicles, cars, is that electric is really on the offensive. It may be other technologies for more heavy vehicles, for instance, hydrogen. The experts have different views. I think the most important we can do is to support research, development, and price emissions. Because if we support the development of new technologies, if we put the price on carbon emission, it will become profitable to develop clean technologies. And then actually we'll leave to the industry to innovate and to find out exactly what is the best solution to the specific task, either to move big battleships or to move small cars or whatever that is. That's not for politicians, but that's for the industry to decide, and then offer those solutions to the military. What I'm absolutely certain about is that if there is a technological revolution taking place in the civilian sector, which is now the case, with less and less dependence on fossil fuels and more new green technologies for all energy solutions in the civilian sector, from electric cars to carbon capture to fuel cells to hydrogen in the civilian sector. It will not be good for the military if we end up as the only fossil fuel sector left in the world some decades from now. That will weaken our military capabilities. So if we want to maintain the technological edge and have the best cars, the best planes, the best technologies, then we need to be green. Not only because we care about climate change, but because we care about having the best technologies in our armed forces. So in the short run, there may be a contradiction between green and military effectiveness. In the long run, green and military effectiveness is the same.
Secretary General, we only have a few minutes left, and I have to ask you one of the burning questions ahead of the next couple of days, and that, of course, is Sweden and Finland and their joining the alliance. Where are we today with that question?
The decisions by Finland and Sweden to apply for membership, they are historic, and that will strengthen the security of Finland and Sweden, of NATO, and be important for the whole transatlantic alliance. At the same time, we need to ensure that when new allies or new countries join the alliance, we have to take into account the security interests of all allies. And Turkey has expressed some serious concerns on issues like terrorism. And we all know that no NATO ally has suffered more terrorist attacks than Turkey. Thousands of people have been killed, and PKK and other groups, they are responsible for these terrorist attacks, and PKK is a terrorist organization. That is something which is also not only many NATO allies proscribe PKK as a terrorist organization, but the European Union, Finland and Sweden. So of course, to sit down then and discuss with Turkey how can we step up, do more together in fighting terrorism, which is a threat to our security, is an issue that is absolutely legitimate and important as part of the accession process we now and dialogue we now have with Finland and Sweden. I will not, promise anything. I can only tell you that I have spoken several times with President Erdogan, with the Finnish and the Finnish president, and with the Swedish Prime Minister. We will meet later on today, President Erdogan, President Niinistö, and Prime Minister Andersson, and I hope that we can make some progress, but let's meet first, and then I can update you afterwards.
Secretary General, all my friends in the press corps are going to be jealous of that. When you think about this a bit more broadly, sir, billions of dollars of weapons and aid going to Ukraine, unprecedented economic sanctions on Russia, the Russian ruble currently stable. Those sanctions undoubtedly will see more effectiveness as time goes on. But there is a big portion of the world, part of the world I live in, the Middle East, and looking out to the Sahel, as you mentioned in your speech earlier, to Africa, elsewhere, very worried about food security issues. They're very worried about famine. They're worried about higher energy costs and, frankly, civil and social unrest. What is NATO's leverage there in convincing countries like China, like India, to pay at a cap for Russian oil or to leave Russian energy supplies altogether?
Well, so first of all, again, the food prices, I fully understand that people all over the world, including in the Middle East and in Africa, are extremely concerned. But the reason for increased food prices is not NATO, it's not sanctions, it is Russia's brutal war against Ukraine, full stop. And if President Putin was willing to stop the war, at least allow ships to sail with grain out of Ukraine, it will help to reduce the food prices. I welcome the fact that NATO allies, in different ways, but in particular Turkey and President Erdogan, are engaged in different initiatives to try to find a way to get grain out also on ships over the Black Sea, but also some initiatives to try to at least increase to some extent the amount of food we are getting out on land over NATO and EU territory in Europe. There are some serious logistical challenges with that, but at least it can help perhaps to increase somewhat the amount we are getting out. Then on China, well, one of the messages we have is that we don't regard China as an adversary, and China, of course, is soon the biggest economy in the world. We need to engage with China, for instance, on issues like climate change. It matters for the whole energy market. But we are disappointed by the fact that China has not been able to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that China is spreading many of the false narratives about NATO, the West, and also that China and Russia are more closer now than have ever been before. We saw that in the joint statement by China and Russia, President Xi and President Putin, in the beginning of February, where they said that the partnership was limitless, I think was the language, but at least they stated very clearly, both China and Russia, that they were against any NATO enlargement, and that is the first time China so explicitly has in a way had a strong opinion directed against NATO and NATO enlargement.
And doesn't that worry you that there is a situation where you could see NATO versus the rest of the world?
But I mean, we cannot stop support Ukraine because not all countries all over the world supports us. Then we had a vote in the UN where 141 nations condemned the invasion. We have a responsibility to support Ukraine, partly by providing support, military support, economic support, humanitarian support. NATO allies have supported Ukraine since 2014. We didn't wake up in February 2022. Actually, I've been in Yavoriv and other places in Ukraine where I've seen Canadian, US, UK, and also NATO personnel training, helping, equipping the Ukrainian armed forces. The Ukrainian armed forces was much better equipped, much better trained, much larger, much better commanded in 2022 than in 2014. And not least because of the support, the training, the equipment they have received for many years from NATO allied countries. It's first and foremost the bravery, the courage of Ukrainians that have enabled to stand up against the brutal Russian invasion, but the support they have achieved from 2014 and onwards has of course also been key. Now our responsibility is to step up, do more, and be ready to stand for the long haul, because this may last. So if the issue is that we should not do this, because it may create the impression that we have some responsibility for some of the problems in the world economy, the answer is absolutely no. We have to continue to support Ukraine, including imposing a price on Russia by imposing sanctions. And then we have to engage in dialogue, in public communications, to explain that the core problem is not the way we support Ukraine. The core problem is the unprovoked, unjustified war by President Putin against Ukraine. That's the problem.
Secretary General, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.